Hey guys, tonight we delve into the life of a man whose voice became a roar of defiance, a figure synonymous with bulldog tenacity and the very spirit of resistance, Winston Churchill. Imagine yourself, for a moment, stepping back into late Victorian England. You're in a grand, sprawling palace, the air thick with the scent of beeswax polish and ancient tapestries. It's a world of rigid hierarchies, of unspoken rules, and immense expectations, especially if you happen to be born into one of its most famous families. This is the world that shaped Churchill, a world he would both embody and fundamentally change. If you were suddenly thrust into his early years, with its daunting classical education, the sheer emotional distance from parental figures, and the expectation to always maintain a stiff upper lip, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this without a serious craving for your noise-canceling headphones and a good therapist. The sheer pressure to conform, to excel in prescribed ways, was immense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. And while you're at it, why not drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our global snoozing community. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey into Winston Churchill's life begins not on a battlefield or in the hallowed halls of Parliament, but within the imposing stone walls of Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, on a chilly November 30th, 1874. Picture the scene of premature birth, adding a touch of unexpected drama to an already highly anticipated arrival. He was, after all, a scion of the illustrious Spencer Churchill family, direct descendants of the first Duke of Marlborough, one of Britain's most celebrated military commanders. The weight of that lineage, the unspoken expectation of greatness, would be a constant companion throughout his life. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant and dazzlingly ambitious politician, known for his sharp wit and equally sharp, sometimes erratic, political maneuvering. A rising star in the Conservative Party, his career, however, would be marked by both meteoric ascent and tragic, premature decline due to illness. Then there was his mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, born Jenny Jerome, a captivating American heiress whose beauty, charm, and social acumen were legendary. She was a whirlwind of energy, a prominent figure in London society, often preoccupied with the intricate dance of politics and social engagements. You might imagine a young Winston basking in the warmth of doting parents. But the reality of Victorian aristocratic upbringing was often quite different. Lord Randolph, frequently consumed by politics or his own deteriorating health, could be a distant and critical figure. You can almost feel the young Winston, sensitive and yearning for paternal approval, often finding only stern judgment or, worse, indifference. He once famously remarked that he loved his mother dearly, but at a distance. Jenny, while certainly affectionate in her own way, was a creature of her social sphere, her energies often directed outwards. Historians still argue whether Winston's relentless drive and almost insatiable ambition were primarily fueled by a deep-seated desire to live up to the legacy of his Marlborough ancestors, to posthumously earn the approval of the brilliant but often absent father he idolized, or if it stemmed from an innate, almost primal patriotic fervor that burned within him from an early age. Perhaps it was a potent cocktail of all three. One thing is certain: this early emotional landscape, marked by a degree of parental detachment, cultivated in him a fierce independence and a profound need to make his mark on the world. He wasn't going to be a footnote in his family's grand history. He was going to write his own epic chapter. Basically, his parents were the 19th century equivalent of being too busy with their own very complicated, very public social media feeds to engage in much hands-on parenting. Your school days, if you were young Winston, would not necessarily be a period of academic triumph, at least not in the conventional sense. He was sent to a series of rather austere preparatory schools, culminating in his entrance to Harrow School in 1888. Imagine yourself in those classrooms, cold, echoing, with long hours spent on subjects that, for Winston, held little appeal. He famously struggled with mathematics and classics, particularly Latin, which he found utterly bewildering. You can almost hear the exasperated sighs of his tutors as he submitted yet another poorly construed Latin sentence. He was, by his own admission, an unpromising student in these areas, often found near the bottom of his class. His reports home were frequently peppered with concerns about his lack of application and his rebellious streak. But to dismiss him as unintelligent would be a grave error. Where his interest was piqued, his mind soared. He devoured books on history, particularly military history, and developed a profound love for the English language. He could spend hours memorizing poetry and crafting his own prose, already showing glimpses of the powerful rhetoric that would one day stir a nation. It was at Harrow that he also discovered a passion for fencing, one of the few school activities where he truly excelled. If only he'd had Wikipedia back then, he might have aced those exams with flying colors. Or, more likely, just spent even more time reading about famous generals and epic battles from history. The path to a traditional university education, like Oxford or Cambridge, seemed unlikely given his academic record. So, the military beckoned, a path well trodden by the sons of the aristocracy, and one that appealed immensely to Winston's burgeoning sense of adventure and his fascination with martial glory. His sights were set on the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. However, even gaining entry to Sandhurst proved a challenge. It's a mainstream historical fact that Churchill had to make 3 attempts to pass the entrance examination. He finally scraped through, qualifying for the cavalry, which, it was whispered, had slightly less demanding academic requirements than the infantry. You might picture him there, finally in his element. The curriculum focused on practical skills like riding, tactics, and military law. He thrived at Sandhurst, graduating 20th in a class of 130 in December 1894. He found a sense of purpose and camaraderie there, a place where his particular talents, his audacity, his grasp of strategy, his physical courage were valued. He finally found a place where knowing how to charge effectively on a horse was considered more useful than conjugating obscure Latin verbs. Priorities. People. Priorities. Even before Sandhurst formally channeled his energies, young Winston possessed an almost uncontainable thirst for adventure and experience. He wasn't content to merely read about the world. He wanted to immerse himself in it, to be where the action was. This wasn't just youthful recklessness. It was a deep-seated desire to understand the mechanics of power, conflict, and human endeavor firsthand. You can see this in his early letters and conversations, a restlessness, a chafing against the confines of his privileged but sometimes stifling upbringing. He yearned for the glittering prizes of life as he would later call them, and instinctively knew they weren't to be found solely in the drawing rooms of London or the quiet countryside of Oxfordshire. This innate craving for excitement, for the thrill of the moment, for the chance to prove his mettle, would soon lead him to the far-flung corners of the British Empire, seeking out danger and opportunity in equal measure. The boy who struggled with Latin was about to step onto a much larger and far more perilous stage. That thirst for adventure we just talked about, that almost palpable yearning for the heat of action you sensed brewing in young Winston, didn't take long to find an outlet. Fresh from Sandhurst, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in early 1895. But the life of a peacetime cavalry officer in England, with its endless drills and social engagements, while comfortable, couldn't quite satisfy the craving for what he called the glittering whirl of events. You can almost picture him, restless in his smart uniform, poring over maps and newspapers, his mind already racing towards distant horizons where history was being made, often at the point of a gun. His first real taste of this came later that same year, not in a British conflict, but in Cuba. Using his family connections and a healthy dose of audacity, the 20-year-old Churchill, accompanied by his friend Reginald Barnes, secured leave to travel to the island to observe the Cuban War of Independence, where rebels were fighting against Spanish colonial rule. He wasn't just a curious tourist. He had arranged to act as a military correspondent for the Daily Graphic in London, and also, more discreetly, as an observer for British military intelligence. You find yourself there with him, under the humid Caribbean sun, notebook in hand, ostensibly a neutral observer attached to the Spanish forces. He was there as an observer, observing how to dodge bullets and write a gripping story about it at the same time. Multitasking level expert. It was in Cuba that he first came under fire, an experience he found, in his own words, exhilarating. He also, famously, developed a lifelong appreciation for Havana cigars during this trip, a small personal detail that would become an iconic part of his public image. But Cuba was just an appetizer. The main course of his early military adventures lay on the volatile northwest frontier of India, now part of Pakistan. In 1897, you're with Lieutenant Churchill, having pulled strings to get himself attached to the Malakand Field Force, which was engaged in suppressing a Pashtun uprising. This wasn't just about observation anymore. He was an active combatant, often placing himself in considerable danger, riding along the skirmish lines and participating in fierce fighting. He wasn't just there to fight, he was there to write, ensuring his exploits wouldn't go unnoticed back home. His dispatches to the Daily Telegraph were vivid and compelling, and he later turned his experiences into his first published book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, 1898. It was a critical success, showcasing his burgeoning literary talent and his ability to transform personal adventure into engaging narrative. The following year, 1898, found him in Sudan, determined to be part of General Kitchener's campaign to reconquer the territory. Again, it took considerable maneuvering. Kitchener was initially reluctant to have the publicity-seeking young officer along, but Churchill prevailed, getting himself attached to the 21st Lancers. You witness him taking part in the Battle of Omdurman, one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history. Imagine the scene: the thundering hooves, the dust, the clash of steel. the sheer terrifying chaos of a cavalry charge against a numerically superior force. Churchill was in the thick of it. Firing his Mauser pistol from horseback, he'd opted against a saber due to a lingering shoulder injury from India. His account of this campaign, the River War 1899, further burnished his reputation as both a courageous soldier and a gifted writer. This relentless pursuit of action and recognition set the stage perfectly for what would become his most famous early exploit. In October 1899, the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa between the British Empire and the two independent Boer republics. Churchill, having briefly resigned his army commission to make an unsuccessful bid for Parliament, saw his opportunity. He wasn't going back as a soldier this time, but as a war correspondent for the prestigious Morning Post, armed with an impressive salary and an even more impressive expense account. You arrive with him in Cape Town, the air buzzing with war fever, the sense of imperial might palpable. Now, fast forward a few weeks to November 15th, 1899. You're on an armored train trundling through Natal. Churchill is aboard, eager to get to the front lines near Ladysmith. The train is a rather conspicuous target, and sure enough, Boer commandos under General Louis Botha have laid a clever ambush. Rocks are piled on the line, and as the train rounds a bend, it's derailed, coming under heavy shell and rifle fire. Chaos erupts. Amidst the bullets and explosions, the 25-year-old Churchill, though technically a civilian non-combatant, takes charge. You see him clambering over wreckage, rallying the panicked soldiers, directing efforts to clear the track and get the engine and part of the train moving again to evacuate the wounded. It's a scene of desperate improvisation under extreme pressure. Civilians weren't supposed to direct military operations, but Winston wasn't your average civilian, was he? He displayed immense courage and coolness. But ultimately, he, along with a number of soldiers, was captured. It's a mainstream historical fact that while Churchill's bravery during the armored train incident was widely acknowledged, some in the military establishment were critical of a civilian correspondent taking such an active, almost command-like role in a military engagement. You then find yourself a prisoner of war in Pretoria, confined with other British officers in the state's model school. The boredom and frustration must have been immense for a man of his temperament. Escape, naturally, became his obsession. Historians still argue whether Churchill's self-promotion and carefully crafted narratives of his adventures, particularly the Boer War escape, exaggerated his actual contributions and the dangers he faced, or simply reflected a young man astutely aware of how to build a public persona in the burgeoning age of mass media and telegraph communication. One evening, just under a month into his captivity, on December 12th, 1899, he made his move. You watch as he scales the perimeter wall during a moment when the sentries' backs are turned. It's a heart-stopping moment of risk. He's out, but alone, in hostile territory, hundreds of miles from friendly lines, with a price on his head. The Boers put out a wanted poster for him, a rather flattering description. All things considered, the Boers probably thought they'd caught a rather talkative and opinionated fish, only to find out he was more of an eel with a megaphone, determined to slip through their fingers. His initial plan to escape with two others fell through, leaving him to navigate the perilous journey solo. Imagine the sheer nerve, walking through the night, hiding by day. His only provisions a few bars of chocolate. Luck, or perhaps Providence, intervened. He stumbled upon a coal mine and, taking a huge risk, approached the English manager, John Howard, who sheltered him for several days in the mine itself before smuggling him onto a freight train bound for Portuguese East Africa. You can almost feel the suffocating darkness of the mine, the gnawing anxiety, then the jolting, dusty confinement of the train, hoping every stop wasn't the one where he'd be discovered. Finally, after an arduous journey, he reached Delagoa Bay in Lorenzo Marques, now Maputo. He was free. The news of his daring escape, when it reached Britain, was like an electric shock. It was a much-needed good news story from a war that wasn't going entirely Britain's way. Churchill, the plucky correspondent who outwitted his captors, became an instant national hero. Suddenly, everyone in Britain knew his name and his story. It's like going viral before. Viral was even a thing, but achieved with considerably more mortal peril and definitely fewer cat videos. This dramatic episode, more than any of his previous adventures, catapulted him into the public consciousness and laid the perfect foundation for the political career he so fervently desired. The boy who had charged at Omdurman and escaped from Pretoria was now a name to be reckoned with. You recall that electrifying news of Churchill's escape from the Boers, how it blazed across Britain, transforming the adventurous young correspondent into a bona fide national hero. Well, that hero status from the Boer War wasn't just a thrilling story for the newspapers. It was pure political gold, and Winston, ever the astute strategist even in his youth, knew exactly how to spend it. He'd already dipped his toe into the political waters before heading to South Africa, making an unsuccessful bid for Parliament as a Conservative candidate in Oldham in 1899. But now, returning to Britain in the summer of 1900, he was no longer just Lord Randolph's son. He was Churchill of Pretoria, a name synonymous with daring and pluck. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The country was in the midst of the khaki election, so called because it was fought against the backdrop of the ongoing Boer War, with patriotic sentiment running high. You're there on the campaign trail with him in Oldham once more. This time, the reception is markedly different. Crowds flock to hear him speak, not just out of curiosity, but out of admiration. His campaign speeches now had an extra zing, delivered by a man who'd faced enemy fire and lived to tell and embellish the tale. He wasn't just shaking hands and kissing babies. He was probably demonstrating how to escape from a Boer prison using only a teacup and a stiff upper lip. Metaphorically speaking, of course. The result, victory. At the age of just 26, Winston Churchill became the Conservative Member of Parliament for Oldham. Imagine yourself stepping into the venerable chamber of the House of Commons in February 1901, ready to witness his maiden speech. The atmosphere is thick with history, the scent of old leather and polished wood, the low murmur of anticipation. This wasn't just any new MP. This was a celebrity, a young man already trailing a reputation for brilliance, boldness, and perhaps a touch of arrogance. He didn't disappoint. His first speech, carefully prepared and memorized, was a confident performance. He spoke on the Boer War, naturally, but with a call for magnanimity and victory, a theme that would recur throughout his career. He was articulate, self-assured, and from the outset, demonstrated that he was not going to be a silent backbencher, content to simply toe the party line. You can almost sense the older, more established parliamentarians exchanging glances. Here was a young man who intended to make his presence felt. He soon fell in with a group of young, independently minded Conservative MPs, including Lord Hugh Cecil, son of the then Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, often referred to as the hooligans, or sometimes, less charitably, the hooligans. Think of them as the parliamentary boy band of their day, only with more tweed, much sharper debating skills, and definitely less synchronized dancing, though they certainly had a knack for disrupting the established rhythm of their own party. They were intellectual, often aristocratic, and unafraid to challenge their own party leadership on issues like army reform and, crucially, economic policy. Churchill, with his sharp intellect and readiness for a verbal skirmish, was a natural fit. It was this issue of economic policy that would lead to the first major turning point in his political career. The Conservative Party, particularly under the powerful influence of Joseph Chamberlain, was increasingly leaning towards tariff reform, essentially abandoning Britain's long-standing policy of free trade in favor of imposing tariffs on imported goods, especially from outside the British Empire. For Churchill, this was anathema. His father, Lord Randolph, had been a champion of Tory democracy and fiscal conservatism, and Winston had inherited a deep belief in the principles of free trade. He saw it not just as an economic doctrine, but as a moral imperative, essential for Britain's prosperity and for keeping the cost of living down for ordinary people. You see him becoming increasingly vocal in his opposition, delivering powerful speeches in the Commons and across the country, defending free trade with a passion that put him directly at odds with the dominant faction in his own party. The tension grew, speech by impassioned speech. You can feel the growing estrangement, the private meetings where party whips tried to bring the rebellious young MP into line, only to find him more resolute. Then, on May 31st, 1904 came the dramatic culmination. It's a moment etched in British political folklore. During a heated debate on a fiscal issue, Winston Churchill, after delivering a speech critical of the Conservative government's stance, did something audacious. He quite literally crossed the floor of the House of Commons. Imagine the scene. He stands up from the Conservative benches, walks down the gangway, pauses to give a customary bow to the Speaker, and then turns to sit down on the opposition benches, amongst the Liberals. It was the political equivalent of dramatically unfriending your entire family on Facebook, publicly announcing your allegiance to a rival online gaming clan, and live streaming the whole thing, all in one very public and very deliberate afternoon. A mainstream historical fact often recounted is that Churchill chose a moment of high drama, ensuring his defection was as public and impactful as possible. He sat initially next to David Lloyd George, another rising star who would become a close ally and, at times, a formidable rival. This act of political apostasy sent shockwaves through Westminster. To the Conservatives, it was an act of profound disloyalty, a betrayal of the party that had nurtured his early career. To some observers, it smacked of opportunism, a calculated move by an ambitious young man hitching his wagon to the rising star of the Liberal Party, which seemed destined for power. Churchill himself, however, framed it as a matter of principle. He famously declared something to the effect of, "Some men change their party for the sake of their principles, others their principles for the sake of their party." He, of course, placed himself firmly in the first category. Historians still argue whether Churchill's decision to switch parties in 1904 was primarily driven by these deeply held convictions on free trade, a conviction that certainly aligned with the core tenets of the Liberal Party at the time, or by a pragmatic and perhaps even cynical calculation of where his formidable ambition and unique talents could best be served and most quickly rewarded. The truth, as is often the case with such complex decisions, likely lies in a combination of both. His new liberal colleagues welcomed him, though perhaps with a degree of caution. A man who could switch allegiances once might do so again. He quickly became one of their most dynamic and aggressive debaters. His speeches often laced with stinging attacks on his former conservative colleagues, who now regarded him with open hostility. You can picture the scene: Churchill, now on the liberal benches, relishing the cut and thrust of debate, his voice already honing that distinctive oratorical style, turning his rhetorical guns on men who, just months before, had been his political brethren. When the Liberals swept to power in a landslide victory in 1906, Churchill's gamble paid off. He was appointed Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, his first taste of governmental office. The young man who had sought adventure on distant battlefields was now firmly embarked on an adventure in the corridors of power, and his decision to cross that famous floor had unequivocally signaled that he was a force to be reckoned with, a politician who would carve his own path. Regardless of convention or expectation, that first taste of governmental office you saw Churchill gain as Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies was just the beginning of his ascent within the powerful Liberal government. You see him moving swiftly through a series of increasingly important roles. In 1908, he becomes president of the Board of Trade, where, working closely with David Lloyd George, he throws his energy into significant social reforms, things like establishing labor exchanges to help the unemployed find work and laying the groundwork for unemployment insurance. It's a period where you see him grappling with the great social questions of the age, a domestic reformer far removed from the battlefields of his youth. Then, in 1910, he's appointed Home Secretary, one of the great offices of state. This role, however, proves more controversial. You witness his firm, some said overly harsh, handling of industrial unrest, notably the Tony Pandy incident in Wales, where he authorized the deployment of troops to support police during a miners' strike. It earned him the lasting enmity of many in the labor movement, a stark contrast to his image as a social reformer. But it was his next appointment, in October 1911, that truly thrust him onto the world stage and into an arena that perfectly suited his strategic mind and boundless energy. You're there as he becomes First Lord of the Admiralty. At just 37, he's now the political head of the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. The context is crucial. Britain is locked in an intense naval arms race with a rapidly industrializing Germany. The Royal Navy is Britain's shield, the guarantor of its empire and its trade routes. Churchill, though lacking a deep naval background, attacked this new challenge with his trademark vigor. He practically lived at the Admiralty, a human dynamo determined to master every nut and bolt, every strategic nuance of naval power. He devoured reports, interrogated admirals, and championed innovation. You witness him spearheading a series of vital and sometimes controversial reforms. One of the most far-reaching was the decision to convert the fleet from coal to oil power. This was a massive technological leap, giving British ships greater speed and efficiency. But it was also a strategic gamble. Britain had abundant coal reserves but virtually no domestic oil, making the Navy dependent on foreign supplies, primarily from Persia. He also pushed for the development of bigger, faster battleships armed with more powerful 15-inch guns, like the new Queen Elizabeth class, ensuring Britain stayed ahead in the naval race. And with remarkable foresight, he championed the fledgling Naval Air Service, the Royal Naval Air Service, even taking flying lessons himself. He was so keen on naval aviation. He even started taking flying lessons himself, earning his pilot's wings. You can just imagine the collective sigh of relief from his wife, Clementine, and his cabinet colleagues when they finally persuaded him that one First Lord of the Admiralty potentially crashing into the sea was probably bad for national morale, not to mention his own longevity. He reluctantly gave up piloting, but his commitment to air power remained. To drive these reforms, he controversially brought back the brilliant, irascible, and elderly Admiral Lord Jackie Fisher as First Sea Lord. Fisher was a legendary naval innovator, but also notoriously difficult to work with. Fisher was a genius, but also a bit like a human volcano, brilliant when erupting ideas, less fun when the lava was aimed directly at you. Their partnership was explosive, a mix of mutual admiration and titanic clashes of will. Yet it undeniably galvanized the Admiralty, thanks in large part to these efforts and Churchill's decisive action. When the storm clouds of war finally broke over Europe in August 1914, the Royal Navy was ready. It's a mainstream historical fact that on the eve of Britain's declaration of war, with tensions at their absolute peak, Churchill, on his own initiative, ordered the Grand Fleet, which had assembled for summer maneuvers, not to disperse as planned. This meant that when war was declared, the most powerful naval force on Earth was already mobilized and at its war stations. A crucial, arguably war-winning decision. The early months of the war saw some naval successes, but also a growing frustration with the deadlock of trench warfare on the Western Front in France and Belgium. Churchill, ever fertile with strategic ideas, began to champion a bold and imaginative plan to break this stalemate. You're in the War Council meetings, listening to him argue passionately for an attack on Ottoman Turkey, which had joined the Central Powers. The idea was to force a fleet through the Dardanelles Straits, bombard Constantinople, Istanbul, knock Turkey out of the war, open a vital supply route to Russia through the Black Sea, and potentially encourage neutral Balkan states like Greece and Bulgaria to join the Allied cause. It was a grand strategic vision, daring and potentially war-altering. This Dardanelles campaign, which would become tragically known as Gallipoli, began with a naval bombardment in February 1915. You witnessed the initial optimism, the belief that the mighty British and French warships could simply blast their way through. But the Turkish defenses, aided by German advice and well-placed sea mines, proved far more resilient than anticipated. A major naval assault on March 18th failed disastrously, with several Allied battleships sunk or crippled. The decision was then made to land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula to capture the forts adequating the straits. In April 1915, British, Irish, French, Australian, and New Zealand, the famous Anzacs troops, stormed ashore. You are thrust into the horror of those landings, the exposed beaches, the murderous Turkish fire from the cliffs above, the dysentery, the flies, the scorching heat, and the appalling casualties. The campaign bogged down into a bloody stalemate, another version of trench warfare, but in even more brutal conditions. As the architect and most vocal champion of the Dardanelles operation, Churchill became the focus of blame. The mounting casualty lists, the lack of progress, the sheer human cost, it all landed squarely on his shoulders. Admiral Fisher, who had always had reservations about the naval aspects of the plan without strong army backing from the start, resigned dramatically in May 1915, a move that fatally undermined Churchill's position. The Conservative opposition, whose support was needed for a new wartime coalition government, made Churchill's removal from the Admiralty a non-negotiable condition. You see him in the aftermath, stripped of his beloved Admiralty, demoted to the largely ceremonial and powerless post of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. From directing the world's most powerful navy, shaping grand strategy, to, well, essentially managing a portfolio of historic estates and appointments. It was the ultimate "you had one job" moment. Except his job involved thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and the fate of an empire. No pressure. The word Gallipoli became a stain on his reputation, a shorthand for ambitious failure and reckless disregard for lives, an accusation that would haunt him for years. Historians still argue whether the Gallipoli campaign was a brilliant strategic concept doomed by flawed execution, inadequate resources, and timid commanders on the ground, or whether it was a fundamentally unsound, overly ambitious plan for which Churchill, through his persuasive oratory and overweening self-confidence, bore the primary and inescapable responsibility. The shadow of those beaches, those lives lost, would be a long one. You remember that crushing demotion to Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, how it must have stung a man like Churchill, so accustomed to the high-octane world of naval strategy and wartime decision-making. Imagine being the dynamic conductor of a vast, thundering orchestra, every musician responding to your every flick of the baton, then suddenly finding yourself demoted to quietly turning the pages for the triangle player in the furthest corner of the stage. That's a pretty accurate measure of how Churchill likely felt. Being Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster sounds grand, a title resonant with ancient dignities. But for Churchill, whose very essence craved action and influence, it was akin to being given the keys to a very old, very quiet, and rather dusty library when all you desperately want to do is direct a massive, explosive fireworks display. The frustration was palpable. He had a seat in the War Council, yes, but without the departmental power of the Admiralty. His voice was diminished, his ideas often sidelined. This state of political purgatory, this feeling of being, as he put it, a subaltern, whose opinion is not asked, couldn't last. You see him chafing under the constraints, his mind still teeming with strategies and critiques of how the war was being prosecuted. So, in November 1915, after just 6 agonizing months in this sinecure, he made another bold move. He resigned from the government altogether. It was a definitive step into what would become known as his first wilderness years, a period out of high office, away from the central levers of power. He was still a member of Parliament, but for a man of his ambition and talents, the backbenches felt like an exile. But Churchill was never one for passive suffering. If he couldn't direct the war from a cabinet room, he would participate in it directly. He rejoined the army, seeking an active command at the front. Many in his position might have opted for a safe staff job well behind the lines, but that wasn't his style. You find yourself with him in early 1916, now a major, soon to be lieutenant colonel, trudging through the notorious mud of Flanders, taking command of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the trenches near Ploegsteert, or Plug Street as the soldiers called it, in Belgium. This was no ceremonial posting. He was in the thick of it, sharing the dangers and discomforts of his men. He might have been a toff, an aristocrat from a palace, but down in the muck and mire of the trenches, he faced the same constant threat of shells, snipers, and disease. The same grinding monotony and mortality as every other soldier. His leadership style in the trenches often surprised those who only knew his pugnacious political persona. He showed a deep concern for the welfare of his men, insisting on better sanitation, improved rations, and more robust trench defenses. While he didn't shy away from necessary risks, he was also notably cautious about wasting lives in futile attacks, a lesson perhaps learned the hard way from Gallipoli. He would venture out into no man's land on patrols, sharing a nip of brandy with his officers, and generally earning the respect and even affection of the Scottish soldiers under his command. They saw a different side of Churchill, brave, yes, but also human, approachable, and genuinely committed to their well-being. Historians still argue whether Churchill's period in the trenches was primarily a genuine act of penance for Gallipoli and a sincere desire to share the common soldier's burden, or if it was also a shrewdly calculated move to rehabilitate his public image, demonstrate his unwavering patriotism, and pave the way for his eventual political comeback. Perhaps, as with many of Churchill's complex motivations, it was a blend of all these things. While he was commanding his battalion in France, the Dardanelles Commission back in London was conducting its inquiry into the Gallipoli campaign. Churchill was granted leave to return briefly to testify. You can imagine him, tanned from the trenches, passionately defending his strategic vision, trying to shift the narrative away from one of pure failure. The Commission's eventual report would offer a mixed verdict, critical of some aspects of the planning and execution, but also acknowledging the complexities and not placing the blame solely on Churchill's shoulders. It was a partial, though not complete, exoneration. After about 6 months on the Western Front, the pull of politics, the desire to be closer to the center of events where he felt he could make a real difference to the war effort, became too strong. Political allies were also working behind the scenes for his return. He relinquished his command in May 1916 and returned to London. He probably brought back with him a newfound and very deep appreciation for the simple luxuries of hot baths and a decent, non-trench issue cigar, and an even stronger, if that were possible, desire to tell everyone in London how the war should be run. He resumed his seat in the House of Commons, still on the outside of government, but now with the added credibility of a frontline commander. This period out of office, however, was far from idle. You see him channeling his formidable energy into two significant pursuits, writing and painting. He began work on the World Crisis, his monumental multi-volume account of the First World War. This wasn't just a historical narrative, it was also his apologia, his chance to explain his own actions, particularly regarding the Dardanelles and Antwerp, and to shape the historical record. It's a mainstream historical fact that Churchill's The World Crisis, published in several volumes through the 1920s, was a significant literary achievement and a commercial success, helping to restore his public reputation and providing him with a much-needed income. Around the same time, in 1915, after the initial shock of his fall from the Admiralty, he discovered a new passion oil painting. Encouraged by his sister-in-law, Lady Gwendolen Goonie Churchill, who was an artist herself, he picked up a brush for the first time. You can picture him, initially hesitant, then completely absorbed, finding an unexpected solace and a vibrant new way to express himself. The man who once meticulously mixed naval deployment strategies now energetically mixed colors on a palette, finding a different kind of battlefield, a more peaceful one, on canvas. Who knew the man renowned for commanding battleships and crafting thunderous speeches could also dabble with delicate brushstrokes and the subtleties of light and shade? Maybe if Gallipoli had been conceived as a watercolor landscape, it might have turned out differently. Or, then again, perhaps not. Painting became a lifelong companion, a refuge from the stresses of political life. Yet, beneath the surface of the writer and the budding artist, the political animal remained restless. You sense his impatience, his burning desire to be back in a position of real influence as the Great War dragged on. He made powerful speeches in Parliament, offered advice often unsolicited and sharply critical to the government, and waited, with growing frustration, for the call that would bring him back from the wilderness. This period, though undoubtedly painful and deeply frustrating for him, was also profoundly formative. It allowed for deep reflection, for significant literary work, and perhaps it even tempered some of his more impulsive tendencies, forging a more resilient, if no less ambitious, statesman. You recall that restless energy, that almost physical craving for action and influence that defined Churchill even during his time in the political wilderness. Well, that period of exile, though formative, was not destined to last indefinitely. The Great War was still raging, and Britain needed capable hands. In July 1917, Prime Minister David Lloyd George, an old Liberal colleague with whom Churchill had a complex relationship of alliance and rivalry, decided to bring him back into government. It wasn't an easy decision for Lloyd George. Many conservatives, now part of the wartime coalition, still harbored deep resentment towards Churchill over Gallipoli and his earlier party switch. But Lloyd George recognized Churchill's immense talents and drive, so you see Churchill appointed as Minister of Munitions. It was a critical role, responsible for equipping the vast British armies fighting on multiple fronts. He threw himself into the task with characteristic gusto. He was basically the nation's quartermaster-in-chief, responsible for making sure the guns kept firing, the shells kept flying, and the tanks, a new innovation he had championed, kept rolling off the production lines. He streamlined processes, resolved industrial disputes, and significantly boosted production. It was a masterful display of administrative skill, helping to rebuild his reputation as a man who could get things done, even under immense pressure. After the war ended in 1918, you follow him as he continues to hold significant cabinet positions. From 1919 to 1921, he served as Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air, overseeing the enormous and complex task of demobilizing millions of soldiers, while also dealing with the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and British intervention there. He was a staunch anti-Bolshevik, advocating for a more robust Allied stance against Lenin's regime. Then, from 1921 to 1922, he moved to become Secretary of State for the colonies, where he played a key role in reshaping the Middle East in the wake of the Ottoman Empire's collapse, including the creation of the modern state of Iraq and the handling of complex issues in Palestine. However, the political tides were shifting again. In 1922, the Lloyd George coalition government fell, and in the ensuing general election, Churchill, who was ill with appendicitis during much of the campaign, lost his parliamentary seat in Dundee. It was a stinging blow. He famously quipped that he found himself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. Oh, it was like that awkward moment when you dramatically announce you're leaving the group chat, only to find the group chat disbands a week later, and then you also lose your phone. A tough break. all around. This marked the beginning of another, albeit shorter, spell in the political wilderness. During this time, his disillusionment with the Liberal Party, which was deeply fractured and declining, intensified. He began to gravitate back towards the Conservative Party, the party of his youth, the party he had so dramatically abandoned 2 decades earlier. You see him standing in the 1923 election as an independent liberal, then as an independent anti-socialist or constitutionalist. Finally, in 1924, with the Conservatives under Stanley Baldwin looking poised for a return to power, Churchill formally rejoined their ranks. It was a move that surprised many, perhaps even himself. It was like that equally awkward moment when you ask to rejoin that same group chat you dramatically left years ago. Guess who's back? You can imagine the raised eyebrows from some of the Tory grandees who remembered his earlier defection all too well. The Conservatives won the 1924 election, and Stanley Baldwin formed a new government. Then came a truly astonishing appointment. Baldwin offered Winston Churchill the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most important job in the government, responsible for the nation's finances. Churchill himself was reportedly flabbergasted. He had hoped for a significant post, but Chancellor. He had no deep background in economics or finance. Legend has it, he even thought Baldwin was joking when he first made the offer. But Baldwin, perhaps seeing Churchill's powerful intellect and drive as assets, or perhaps wanting to keep a formidable figure like Churchill firmly inside his cabinet tent, was serious. And so, you find yourself observing Churchill as Chancellor, a role that would prove to be one of the most challenging and controversial of his pre-war career. The defining decision of his tenure, and one that would cast a long shadow, was the return to the gold standard in 1925. Imagine the economic landscape Britain was still recovering from the massive financial strain of the war. The Treasury, the Bank of England, and the prevailing economic orthodoxy of the time strongly advocated for restoring the pound sterling to its pre-war parity with gold. It was seen as a matter of national prestige, a signal of financial stability, and a return to sound money. Churchill, initially skeptical and expressing private doubts about the potential deflationary impact, was ultimately persuaded by his expert advisors, including the formidable governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman. It's a mainstream historical fact that Britain's return to the gold standard in April 1925 at the pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 to the pound is now widely considered by economists to have been a serious policy error. It effectively overvalued the pound, making British exports, especially coal, much more expensive on international markets. This hit Britain's already struggling staple industries hard, leading to increased unemployment and deflation. The brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes was one of the most vocal contemporary critics, arguing passionately that the policy would prove disastrous. Historians still argue whether Churchill, as Chancellor, was a reluctant implementer of the prevailing economic orthodoxy regarding the gold standard, genuinely convinced by the near-unanimous advice of his officials, or if he simply lacked the profound economic depth and confidence to fully grasp the potential negative consequences and to successfully resist the powerful tide of expert opinion. The economic hardship exacerbated by the return to the gold standard, particularly in the coal industry where owners sought to cut wages and lengthen hours, led directly to increased industrial tension. This culminated in the general strike of May 1926. You witnessed Churchill taking a very firm, combative stance against the strikers. he became editor of the government's emergency propaganda newspaper, the British Gazette, which presented a staunchly anti-strike narrative. His rhetoric was often inflammatory, and he was viewed by many in the labor movement and among the working classes as a hard-hearted enemy. He approached the general strike with much the same combative, almost military spirit he might have shown to an enemy force, which didn't exactly endear him to the hundreds of thousands of striking miners and other workers. His 5 years as chancellor, from 1924 to 1929, were a rocky road indeed. Beyond the gold standard and the general strike, he grappled with balancing the budget, attempting to fund modest social programs while adhering to principles of fiscal economy. His budgets were often inventive. He was known for raiding various funds, but they also drew considerable criticism. This period was a tough learning experience, and the economic difficulties that marked his chancellorship, fairly or unfairly, added another layer of controversy to his career, further complicating his already complex public image as Britain headed towards the end of the Roaring Twenties and into an even more uncertain global future. You'll recall that rocky road Winston Churchill navigated as Chancellor of the Exchequer, a period marked by controversial decisions like the return to the gold standard and the ensuing economic turbulence, including the general strike. Well, that particular chapter of his career came to an end in 1929 when the Conservative government, led by Stanley Baldwin, was defeated in the general election. Ramsay MacDonald formed a Labour government, and once again, you find Churchill out of high office. This time, however, it wasn't to be a brief interlude. It marked the beginning of his second, and arguably more profound, wilderness years, a decade of political isolation that would stretch through most of the 1930s. It seemed like every time he got comfortable in a big government chair, the political furniture got rearranged, leaving him somewhat stranded on the periphery. Initially, as you observe him in the early 1930s, his primary focus of opposition, the issue that truly set him apart from the consensus within his own Conservative Party, was India. The prevailing political mood, even within conservative circles led by Baldwin, was moving towards granting India greater self-government, eventually leading to dominion status. For Churchill, a man deeply imbued with a sense of Britain's imperial destiny, this was anathema. He launched a vociferous, die-hard campaign against these proposals, delivering powerful, if increasingly isolated, speeches. You see him as a figure fighting a rearguard action for an empire he believed was being carelessly dismantled. While his conviction was undoubtedly sincere, this stance alienated many potential allies and further cemented his image in some quarters as a man out of touch with the changing times. A voice from a bygone era, he managed to annoy people on the left, right, and center with his India views. He wasn't exactly making it easy for them to listen to him when he started talking about other, even graver, dangers. And those dangers were indeed beginning to gather with terrifying speed. Across the North Sea, in Germany, a dark shadow was lengthening. You witnessed the Weimar Republic crumbling. And in January 1933, Adolf Hitler, leader of the Nazi Party, is appointed chancellor. Swiftly, methodically, Hitler consolidates his power, dismantling democratic institutions, suppressing dissent, and, ominously, beginning a program of clandestine rearmament in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. It is against this backdrop that Churchill's focus begins to shift, or rather, expand. While still deeply engaged with the India question, his attention becomes increasingly drawn to the menacing developments in Germany. Churchill out of office was like a thunderstorm trying to stay quiet, in a very small teacup. The energy, the intellect, the sheer force of his personality just had to go somewhere. And increasingly, it went into warning Britain and the world about the nascent threat of Nazism. He began to speak out, in Parliament, in newspaper articles, and in public speeches, with growing urgency and alarm about the pace of German rearmament, particularly the secret development of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. You see him, often a solitary figure on the backbenches, meticulously gathering information from a network of contacts, civil servants, military officers, journalists, even disillusioned Germans, painting a detailed and disturbing picture of Germany's aggressive intentions and rapidly expanding military capabilities, while many others in Britain and Europe were hoping for the best, perhaps lulled by Hitler's early peace rhetoric, or simply unwilling to contemplate another devastating war. Churchill was poring over intelligence reports, production figures for aircraft, and accounts of military training, connecting some very scary dots. He later famously referred to these years as the locust years, a time when the Western democracies, through complacency, fear, or wishful thinking, allowed the threat to grow, failing to rearm adequately or to present a united front against aggression. But why were his warnings, which in retrospect seem so prescient, so widely ignored at the time? You can identify several key factors. Firstly, there was the profound war weariness in Britain. The horrors of the First World War had left an indelible scar on the national psyche. The phrase, "never again," wasn't just a political slogan. It was a deep, visceral, national trauma, fostering a powerful pacifist sentiment across society. Any politician who seemed to be advocating for rearmament or a confrontational foreign policy risked being labeled a warmonger. Secondly, the official government policy, under Prime Ministers Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, and later Neville Chamberlain, became one of appeasement. This was a policy based on the belief that by making concessions to Hitler's grievances, many of which were seen, initially, as understandable claims to revise the harsher aspects of the Versailles Treaty, war could be averted. Figures like Churchill, who advocated for a stronger stance and rapid rearmament, were seen as undermining these delicate diplomatic efforts. Thirdly, Churchill's own reputation played a part. His past record, Gallipoli's shadow, still lingered. The controversial gold standard decision, his die-hard stance on India, made it easier for his critics to dismiss him as erratic, unreliable, a man whose judgment couldn't be trusted. It's a bit like the boy who cried wolf, even though Churchill had been right about some things in the past, like the readiness of the fleet in 1914. His more recent pronouncements and political battles had, for many, damaged his credibility. This time, however, the wolf was terrifyingly real and busy building panzer divisions and bomber squadrons. A mainstream historical fact is that Churchill consistently warned throughout the mid-1930s that German air rearmament was far outpacing British efforts, providing specific figures and timelines that were often dismissed by the government as exaggerated or alarmist, only to be proven largely accurate later on. His speeches on air defense, filled with detailed technical knowledge and stark warnings of the vulnerability of British cities to aerial bombardment, were particularly powerful, even if they failed to immediately shift policy. He spoke of Britain's long, unprotected flank to air attack from the continent. He wasn't entirely alone, of course. A small group of MPs and public figures, sometimes dubbed Churchill's Group or the Vigilantes, including men like Brendan Bracken, Robert Boothby, and his son-in-law Duncan Sandys shared his anxieties and worked to amplify his warnings. But they were a distinct minority. Historians still argue whether Churchill's persistent and almost obsessive focus on the German air threat was a uniquely prescient insight based on superior intelligence and analysis, or if it also reflected a more general anxiety about the devastating potential of air power that was common in the interwar period, albeit voiced by him with unparalleled force, eloquence, and consistency. It must have been an incredibly frustrating time for him. You can imagine him, night after night, delivering these meticulously prepared, deeply felt warnings to a largely indifferent or even hostile House of Commons, or writing yet another article laying out the stark facts, only to see events continue their grim march towards disaster. It must have felt like shouting, "Fire!" in a crowded theater where almost everyone is wearing noise-canceling headphones and engrossed in watching a very dull, very long, and utterly misleading movie about lasting peace. Yet, despite the loneliness of his position and the frequent dismissals he faced, he never wavered. These lonely, often thankless, years of Cassandra-like prophecy, of being the unheeded prophet, were paradoxically laying the essential groundwork for his future leadership. When the storm he had so long predicted finally broke, people would remember who had warned them. You remember those lonely years of the 1930s, Churchill's voice crying out in the political wilderness, warning of the rising storm in Nazi Germany, while most of Britain, haunted by the ghosts of the Great War, clung desperately to the hope of peace. Those warnings, as you saw, largely fell on deaf ears, dismissed by many as the ramblings of a warmonger or a man whose best days were behind him. But history, as it so often does, has a grim way of vindicating its prophets. You witnessed the international crisis deepening with alarming speed through 1938. In March, Hitler, emboldened by the lack of concerted opposition, annexes Austria in the Anschluss. Churchill's denunciations in the House of Commons grow louder, more insistent. Then comes the Sudeten crisis in September. Hitler demands the German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia, and Europe teeters on the brink of war. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flies to Germany 3 times, desperately seeking a peaceful solution. The culmination is the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France concede to Hitler's demands, effectively sacrificing Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of no further territorial claims. Chamberlain returns to London, waving a piece of paper jointly signed with Hitler, proclaiming peace for our time. Churchill basically said, in far more eloquent terms, that piece of paper's not worth the paper it's printed on. You're in the Commons as Churchill delivers a searing indictment of the Munich Agreement. His words are stark, almost brutal. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. It was a deeply unpopular speech at that precise moment. Many MPs cheered Chamberlain, relieved that war had seemingly been averted. But it was one of those "I told you so" moments, delivered in advance, on a terrifyingly grand scale, and as events would soon prove, nobody would be laughing for long. The illusion of peace bought at Munich shattered within 6 months. In March 1939, Hitler, contemptuously violating his promises, orders German troops to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. There could be no more pretending, no more wishful thinking about Hitler's ultimate intentions. You can feel the mood in Britain shifting dramatically. The scales fall from many eyes. Suddenly, Chamberlain's umbrella, that symbol of his appeasement policy, didn't look like such a great shield against a panzer division after all. The public, once so keen to avoid confrontation, now begins to clamor for a stronger stance. It's amazing how quickly that warmongering chap Churchill started to become, actually, maybe that Churchill fellow had a point all along. Once the tanks started rolling into Prague, Britain, now thoroughly alarmed, issues guarantees to Poland, Romania, and Greece, pledging to defend their independence. Rearmament efforts, which had been slowly gathering pace, are finally given urgent priority. But it's dangerously late in the day. The locust years, as Churchill had termed them, had eaten away precious time. Then, in August 1939, comes a diplomatic bombshell that stuns the world the Nazi-Soviet pact. Hitler and Stalin, ideological arch-enemies, sign a non-aggression treaty, secretly carving up Poland and Eastern Europe between them. This cynical pact, which Churchill had implicitly warned against by advocating for some form of alliance with Soviet Russia to contain Hitler, effectively gives Germany a green light to invade Poland without fear of a two-front war. The final act of the prelude to war plays out with chilling inevitability. On September 1st, 1939, German forces storm across the Polish border. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, is unleashed upon a stunned world. Britain and France issue an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw your troops, or a state of war will exist. The deadline passes. You're listening, along with millions of others across Britain and the Empire, to the wireless on the morning of Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. The grave, tired voice of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain fills the airwaves. I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. The dreaded moment has arrived, and with it, an almost universal demand echoes through the press. The public and the corridors of Parliament Churchill must be brought into the government. The man who had been so consistently right about Hitler, whose warnings had been so tragically ignored, is now seen as indispensable. His years in the wilderness, his detailed study of German military power, his unwavering defiance, all these now transform from perceived liabilities into essential assets. Chamberlain, bowing to the inevitable, and perhaps recognizing the need for Churchill's unique qualities, offers him a place in his war cabinet, the position First Lord of the Admiralty. You can't miss the extraordinary historical resonance. It's the very same post Churchill had held at the outbreak of the First World War, 25 years earlier. The same post from which he had been so painfully dismissed after the Gallipoli disaster. Now, at the dawn of an even greater conflict, he was back. It's a mainstream historical fact that upon Churchill's reappointment, the Board of Admiralty sent a now famous signal to all ships and naval bases: Winston is back. The Admiralty signal, Winston is back, must have sent a shiver down some spines in the German Navy and probably caused a few celebratory toasts in the Royal Navy's mess decks. The old Bulldog was off the leash and back in the kennel he knew best. You see him arrive at the Admiralty that evening, a man of nearly 65 but crackling with an almost boyish energy and a lifetime of experience. He's back in his element, a familiar charge in the air. It was like a master mariner finally being called to take the helm in the midst of a gathering hurricane. A sense of grim relief for many, but also an undeniable surge of confidence that a firm hand was now on the tiller of the Royal Navy. The initial months of the war, from late 1939 into early 1940, became known as the Phony War, or, as some wits termed it, the Boer War, because of the relative lack of major land combat on the Western Front. But at sea, the war was very real from day one, with U-boat attacks on shipping and naval engagements. Churchill, as First Lord, is a whirlwind of activity, brimming with ideas, memoranda, and demands for action. He's already impatient with the comparative lull, already thinking of ways to take the fight to the enemy. Some of his proposals, like a plan to mine Norwegian territorial waters to disrupt German iron ore supplies, proving controversial even within the War Cabinet. Historians still argue whether Chamberlain's decision to appoint Churchill specifically to the Admiralty was a genuine recognition of his unique and indispensable qualities for that particular role, recalling his dynamic leadership there in the First World War, or if it was a more politically calculated move to absorb a powerful and popular critic into the government, thereby sharing the immense responsibility for the difficult and dangerous times that lay undeniably ahead. Whatever the precise calculation, Winston was indeed back, and the war, and Britain's leadership, would never be the same. You remember that Winston is back energy you witnessed when Churchill returned to the Admiralty, a surge of dynamism injected into Britain's war effort. That initial period of the phony war at sea was about to give way to shocking, rapid developments on land, putting not just Churchill, but the very survival of Britain to the ultimate test. The relative quiet on the Western Front was the deceptive calm before an unprecedented storm. Churchill, as First Lord, had been a vocal advocate for more aggressive action, particularly intervention in neutral Norway to deny Germany vital iron ore supplies transported through Norwegian waters and to preempt a German seizure of Norwegian ports. You see the plan taking shape in early 1940, a combined Anglo-French operation. However, the ensuing Norwegian campaign, beginning in April, quickly turned into a debacle for the Allies. German forces, acting with speed and ruthless efficiency, invaded Norway just ahead of the Allied landings. The Allied response was often hesitant, poorly coordinated, and inadequately supplied. The Norway campaign was a bit like a badly planned camping trip, except with more fjords, fewer marshmallows, and actual Nazis. Though Churchill was a prime architect of the naval strategy and a key instigator of the campaign, and thus bore considerable responsibility for its shortcomings, the ultimate political fallout landed squarely on the shoulders of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. The recriminations culminated in the famous Norway debate in the House of Commons on May 7th and 8th, 1940. You're there, sensing the palpable anger and frustration amongst MPs from all parties. Speaker after speaker rose to condemn the government's handling of the war. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of impending political doom for Chamberlain. In a devastating moment, Conservative MP Leo Amery, quoting Oliver Cromwell, turned to Chamberlain and declared, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." When the House divided, the government's usually substantial majority plummeted. Chamberlain had won the vote, but lost his authority. It was clear he could not continue to lead a nation at war with such fractured support, as if scripted for maximum dramatic impact. On the very day the political crisis in Britain was reaching its climax, May 10th, 1940, Hitler unleashed his long-feared blitzkrieg in the west. German forces stormed into France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The speed and ferocity of the assault were stunning. Just as Westminster was navigating its own internal political meltdown, Hitler decided to throw the mother of all military parties on France's doorstep, and the Western allies were caught catastrophically off guard. Chamberlain knew his time was up. Critically, the Labour Party, whose participation was essential for a truly national unity government, made it clear they would serve in such a government, but not under his leadership. The question then became, who would succeed him? You're privy to the intense, behind-the-scenes discussions. Two main contenders emerged: Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, a respected, aristocratic figure favored by King George VI and many within the conservative establishment, and Winston Churchill. The decisive meeting occurred on the afternoon of May 10th. Chamberlain, Halifax, Churchill, and the Conservative Chief Whip, David Margeson, gathered to determine the succession. It's a mainstream historical fact that during this crucial meeting, Lord Halifax effectively ruled himself out of contention. He argued that it would be too difficult to lead a wartime government from the House of Lords, unable to directly address the Commons where so much of the daily political battle would be fought. Churchill, significantly, remained silent during much of Halifax's disquisition, allowing Halifax to articulate the reasons against his own premiership. Historians still argue whether Lord Halifax's reluctance to grasp the premiership was genuinely rooted in his concerns about his peerage and a perceived unsuitability for the brutal demands of wartime leadership from the House of Lords, or if he, with considerable astuteness, recognized the almost impossibly dire military situation unfolding across the Channel and preferred to let Churchill, with his established reputation for pugnacity and resilience, inherit what looked increasingly like a poisoned chalice, choosing between Halifax, the smooth, unflappable, aristocratic diplomat, and Churchill, the rumbling, cigar-chomping, emotionally expressive bulldog, was quite the dilemma for the political establishment of the day. One looked like he'd calmly negotiate terms, the other like he'd instinctively bite any hand that threatened him. With Halifax demurring, the choice fell upon Churchill. Later that day, you accompany him in spirit as he travels to Buckingham Palace. King George VI, who initially had reservations about Churchill's judgment and impetuosity, formally asked him to form a government. So, on the very same day that German tanks were pouring into France and the Low Countries, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Talk about a challenging first day on the job. Most new leaders just struggle to find the coffee machine and remember their security passcode. No pressure. Winston, just save Western civilization. And maybe try not to spill your brandy on the king's rather expensive carpets. His first act was to form a true national government, bringing in key labor figures like Clement Attlee, who became Deputy Prime Minister, and the powerful trade union leader Ernest Bevin as Minister of Labor, as well as Archibald Sinclair, leader of the Liberal Party. This cross-party unity was absolutely vital for the immense struggle ahead, and the situation he inherited was beyond dire. As May 1940 unfolded, the Allied armies in France were reeling under the German onslaught. The French defenses were collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was in full retreat, soon to be encircled and trapped at the French port of Dunkirk. Its back to the sea. Britain itself, with its army largely stranded in France, seemed terrifyingly vulnerable to imminent invasion. Nazi Germany, triumphant and seemingly invincible, dominated continental Europe. Britain stood virtually alone. This was, without any shadow of a doubt, the nation's darkest hour. 3 days after becoming Prime Minister, on May 13th, Churchill stood before the House of Commons to seek its confidence. You're there, listening to that now legendary speech, his voice gravelly but resolute. He offered no false hopes, no easy promises. I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined this government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. He defined his policy in stark terms. It is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. And his aim, it is victory, victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory, however long and hard the road may be. The cheers that greeted him were not just for the man, but for the indomitable spirit he embodied. He had reached the pinnacle of his lifelong ambition, not in a time of peace and prosperity, but at a moment of supreme national and global peril. It seemed that his entire, varied, often controversial life, his adventures, his military service, his political battles, his years in the wilderness warning of this very storm, had been an unconscious preparation for this single, terrible, and magnificent hour. You were there as Winston Churchill took the helm in Britain's darkest hour, that pivotal May of 1940, with France crumbling and the thunder of German panzers echoing across the Channel. The promise he made of blood, toil, tears, and sweat was no mere rhetoric. It was a stark prophecy of the ordeal to come, and that ordeal began almost immediately. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, was trapped, their backs to the sea at Dunkirk, facing annihilation or capture. What followed was what Churchill himself would later call a miracle of deliverance. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, unfolded. You see an extraordinary armada of vessels, from Royal Navy destroyers to the famous little ships, private yachts, fishing boats, pleasure craft, sailing into a maelstrom of bombs and shells to rescue the stranded soldiers. Over 338,000 Allied troops were snatched from the beaches. Churchill didn't sugarcoat the situation. In his monumental speech to the Commons on June 4th, he acknowledged the colossal military disaster. And he didn't try to spin Dunkirk as a victory. It was a retreat, born of necessity. But it was also a miracle of deliverance, snatched from the very jaws of defeat, like finally finding your house keys after you were absolutely sure they were gone forever. Only in this case, the house keys represented the bulk of Britain's trained army. And in that same speech, he articulated Britain's unyielding resolve. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. His fight on the beaches speech basically told Hitler, bring it on, mate. We've got deck chairs, a few rusty pitchforks, and some very determined grandmothers ready for you. The relief of Dunkirk, however, was quickly overshadowed. France, Britain's principal ally, battered and broken by the Blitzkrieg, capitulated in late June 1940. Britain now stood utterly alone, facing a triumphant Nazi Germany that controlled virtually all of Western and Central Europe. Invasion seemed not just possible, but terrifyingly imminent. It was in this moment of supreme peril, as France was falling, that Churchill delivered another of his defining speeches on June 18th. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation, but called upon the British people to brace themselves for their duty, concluding with words that would resonate through history. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" Hitler, now master of continental Europe, turned his attention to subduing Britain. His plan for invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, depended on achieving air superiority over southern England and the Channel, and so, through the summer and early autumn of 1940, the Battle of Britain raged in the skies. You witnessed the young pilots of RAF Fighter Command, heavily outnumbered, scrambling day after day, night after night, to intercept the waves of German bombers and fighters. It was a battle fought by the few, as Churchill would immortalize them. He was a constant presence during this period, visiting airfields, meeting with commanders like Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, and closely monitoring the desperate struggle. His tribute to these airmen on August 20th captured the nation's heart. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. A mainstream historical fact often highlighted is that during the critical months of the Battle of Britain, British aircraft production, significantly boosted by the dynamic leadership of Lord Beaverbrook as Minister of Aircraft Production, a man Churchill had personally tasked with this vital job, managed to replace losses of Spitfires and Hurricanes at a rate that often surprised the Germans and proved absolutely crucial to the RAF's ultimate, narrow victory. When the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air supremacy, Hitler postponed, and eventually abandoned, Operation Sea Lion. But the ordeal for Britain was far from over. Frustrated in his attempt to destroy the RAF, Hitler switched tactics, unleashing a relentless bombing campaign against British cities, the Blitz. From September 1940 through to May 1941, night after night, the sirens would wail. You're there, in London or Coventry, Liverpool or Plymouth, experiencing the terrifying drone of German bombers, the crump of exploding bombs, the infernos sparked by incendiary devices, the nights spent huddled in cramped Anderson shelters in back gardens or in the crowded, fetid atmosphere of London Underground stations. You see the devastation, entire streets reduced to rubble, historic landmarks ablaze, the mounting toll of civilian casualties. Throughout this terrifying period, Churchill was the embodiment of defiance. He was not some remote leader, hidden away in a deep bunker miles from the danger. He was there, visible, sharing the risks. You'd see him picking his way through still smoking ruins shortly after a raid, his cigar clamped firmly in place, often with tears in his eyes at the suffering he witnessed, but always with a bulldog glare of anger and determination directed towards the enemy. He would tour the bombed-out areas of London's East End, offering words of comfort and encouragement, his presence a powerful symbol of solidarity and defiance. His staff often despaired as he insisted on watching air raids from rooftops at Number 10 or the Admiralty Annex, eager to witness the battle firsthand. And then there were the speeches. Historians still argue whether Churchill's stirring oratory primarily reflected the already existing mood of gritty British defiance, or if it actively shaped, sustained, and indeed magnified that resolve during the darkest days of the Blitz and the ever-present threat of invasion. What is undeniable is their profound impact. In an age before 24/7 television news and the immediacy of social media, His voice on the wireless radio was the nation's rallying cry, a direct line to defiance and hope. That voice, gravelly, powerful, uniquely accented, could probably curdle milk in Berlin, but it put steel directly into British spines. It was the ultimate keep calm and carry on, but delivered with considerably more growl and magnificent rhetorical flourishes. His mastery of the English language, his deep sense of history, his ability to frame the struggle in epic, almost biblical terms, his unwavering conviction in ultimate victory, all these combined to create an extraordinary bond between leader and people. Phrases like, "We shall never surrender," their finest hour, and never was so much owed by so many to so few, became more than just words. They became articles of faith, national mantras that sustained a people under unimaginable pressure. His leadership was more than just words. Of course, it was the tireless energy, the relentless questioning, the driving force he brought to every aspect of the war effort. But it was his oratory, broadcast into millions of homes, that gave voice to the nation's courage and its stubborn refusal to yield. He took the grim reality of that blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and somehow, through the alchemy of his words and the force of his spirit, helped to transform Britain's darkest hour into what history would indeed remember as its finest. Section 11. You remember how Britain, during its finest hour, stood defiantly alone against the might of Nazi Germany. Its people sustained by Churchill's indomitable spirit and stirring words. That lonely vigil, however heroic, was not a sustainable path to victory. Churchill knew, with absolute clarity, that Britain could not defeat Hitler without powerful allies. And so, even as the bombs of the Blitz rained down, a significant portion of his prodigious energy was dedicated to the complex, often delicate task of forging the alliances that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. In early 1941, despite the RAF's victory in the Battle of Britain, the strategic situation remained incredibly precarious. Britain and its empire were still the sole major combatants against Germany and its ally, Italy, which had opportunistically joined the war in June 1940. The lifeline across the Atlantic, the flow of supplies from the United States, was crucial. From the moment he became Prime Minister, you witnessed Churchill cultivating an intensely personal and strategically vital relationship with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Their correspondence was prolific, with Churchill often signing his cables as former naval person, a nod to their shared past experiences leading their respective navies, an early, tangible sign of this burgeoning, though still unofficial, alliance was the Destroyers for Bases deal in September 1940, where the U.S. provided 50 aging destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for basing rights in British territories. It was a clever workaround for a neutral America wanting to help a desperate Britain. The real breakthrough, however, came in March 1941 with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act by the U.S. Congress. You can almost feel Churchill's immense relief. This ingenious piece of legislation allowed Britain and later other allies to obtain vast quantities of vital war materials, ships, aircraft, tanks, food, from the United States without immediate payment. It was, in essence, America giving Britain a giant wartime credit card with a wonderfully vague, "Pay us back when you can," or perhaps never, "Just make absolutely sure you win this thing" kind of vibe. It was a lifeline, an arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt termed it, that enabled Britain to keep fighting when its own financial resources were stretched to breaking point. Then, In August 1941 came a highly symbolic meeting. You see Churchill and Roosevelt conferring secretly aboard warships anchored in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. Though the U.S. was still officially neutral, they issued the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration outlining common principles for a post-war world, including self-determination, free trade, and freedom from fear and want. It was a powerful statement of shared values and a clear signal of increasing Anglo-American alignment against Nazi tyranny. The global strategic landscape shifted seismically on June 22, 1941. Hitler, in a move of colossal strategic folly, launched Operation Barbarossa, the surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the arch-communist state, which had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler just 2 years earlier, was fighting for its life against the same enemy as Britain. Churchill's reaction was instantaneous and profoundly pragmatic. Despite his lifelong, deeply ingrained anti-communism, you hear him broadcast to the world that very evening, "Any man or state who fights on against Nazism will have our aid. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and the Russian people." He famously quipped to his private secretary, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." For Churchill, the enemy of his enemy was, at least for the duration of this existential struggle, his rather alarming, ideologically opposed, and heavily mustachioed new friend. This decision to embrace Stalin as an ally was crucial. The Eastern Front would become the primary meat grinder of the German army, absorbing the vast majority of its men and materiel. The final decisive piece of the global alliance fell into place on December 7th, 1941. You're with Churchill at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, when the news breaks Imperial Japan has launched a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Germany and Italy, honoring their tripartite pact with Japan, declared war on the United States a few days later. America was now fully in the war. Churchill's immediate reaction was one of profound relief and grim satisfaction. He wrote later that night that he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, knowing that with America's colossal industrial might and manpower now committed to the Allied cause, ultimate victory, however long and hard the road, was assured. It's a mainstream historical fact that Churchill was at Chequers when he heard the news of Pearl Harbor. He immediately grasped its immense significance, dictating messages and making plans, understanding that American entry into the war transformed the entire strategic calculus, making Allied victory virtually certain in the long run, though many dark days still lay ahead. Within weeks, Churchill was crossing the Atlantic again, this time for the Arcadia Conference in Washington, late December 1941, January 1942 to confer with Roosevelt. Here, the Big Three began to truly take shape. Though Stalin was not physically present at this first major Anglo-American strategy conference after Pearl Harbor, the fundamental Germany First strategy was agreed upon, despite the attack by Japan. The main effort of the Grand Alliance would be to defeat Nazi Germany, seen as the most dangerous and powerful enemy, before turning the combined full might of the Allies against Japan. Forging and maintaining this grand alliance between the democratic West Britain and the USA and the communist Soviet Union, led by three such powerful and disparate personalities as Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, was an immense challenge. Imagine Churchill, the quintessential British aristocrat who loved his cigars, brandy, and grand rhetoric, having to sit down for lengthy, often vodka-fueled, negotiations with Joseph Stalin, the ruthless, paranoid dictator who probably preferred, well, Whatever ruthless, paranoid dictators prefer, awkward diplomatic dinner parties, much Churchill, the seasoned wartime leader, initially held a certain seniority. But as the war progressed, he increasingly found himself in the difficult position of managing the often conflicting interests and the burgeoning power of his two colossal partners. Stalin constantly pressed for a second front in Western Europe to relieve the immense pressure on the Red Army. There were also significant differences in war aims and post-war visions, particularly between Churchill, who was determined to preserve the British Empire, and Roosevelt, who was generally more anti-colonial in outlook, not to mention the fundamental ideological chasm and expansionist ambitions of Stalin versus the Western leaders. Historians still argue whether Churchill's immediate and unequivocal pledge of support for the Soviet Union following Operation Barbarossa was purely a masterstroke of pragmatic statesmanship that fundamentally and positively altered the course of the war, or an unavoidable, if uncomfortable, necessity that, by strengthening a totalitarian regime, inadvertently sowed some of the seeds for future Cold War tensions. What is beyond dispute is that his tireless efforts to build and sustain this often fraught coalition through personal diplomacy, countless transatlantic journeys often in perilous wartime conditions, and endless strategic debates were absolutely central to the eventual Allied victory. Deciding on priorities like Germany first was like a very complicated global family argument about which existential threat to tackle first. Everyone had a strong opinion, but eventually they had to agree on a primary target. Even if Uncle Joe Stalin kept grumbling about wanting a different kind of beachhead, sooner rather than later, Churchill's role as the linchpin, the persuader, the sometimes abrasive but always committed bridge builder, was one of his most significant contributions to winning the Second World War. You've seen how Winston Churchill, through sheer grit and masterful diplomacy, helped forge the Grand Alliance, bringing together the vastly different powers of the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the Big Three, against the Axis. That alliance, as you witnessed, was cemented by America's entry into the war after Pearl Harbor and Germany's fateful decision to invade Russia. But forming an alliance is one thing. Agreeing on how to actually win a global war, fought across multiple continents and oceans, is quite another. You're now plunged into the heart of wartime decision-making, where Churchill, as Britain's Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, found himself at the center of relentless, often contentious, strategic debates. It wasn't just about inspiring speeches anymore, crucial as those were. It was about making agonizing choices with immediate life and death consequences for millions. One of the most persistent and challenging debates revolved around the Second Front. From the moment Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin began to apply immense and unrelenting pressure on Britain and, later, America, for a major Anglo-American invasion of northern France. His reasoning was brutally simple. A landing in France would compel Hitler to divert scores of divisions from the Eastern Front, thereby relieving the colossal pressure on the Red Army, which was bearing the overwhelming brunt of the land war against Germany. American military leaders, like General George C. Marshall and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, also generally favored a direct assault on Germany through France as the quickest and most decisive route to victory. They saw it as a concentrated application of force against the main enemy. Stalin wanted a second front like a demanding kid wants a giant ice cream sundae, right now, preferably yesterday, and with extra cherries on top, the cherries in this case being German divisions. Churchill, however, you see approaching this with considerably more caution, even skepticism, particularly regarding an early invasion. His mind was scarred by the horrific attrition of trench warfare in the First World War and the ghosts of Gallipoli, that ill-fated amphibious operation he himself had championed, still haunted him. He profoundly feared that a premature or ill-prepared cross-channel attack could result in a catastrophic bloodbath, potentially setting back the Allied cause for years. He was also acutely aware that in the earlier stages of the war, before American manpower was fully mobilized and deployed, British forces would likely bear the disproportionate share of casualties in such an assault. Instead, Churchill advocated for a more peripheral, attritional strategy first. He championed the idea of clearing Axis forces from North Africa, securing the Mediterranean shipping lanes, and then attacking what he famously called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy, and the Balkans. Churchill's soft underbelly approach might have sounded like a gentle, almost ticklish poke to some, but in reality, it still involved a heck of a lot of fierce fighting and strategic maneuvering. This Mediterranean strategy led to Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in late 1942, and subsequently to the invasions of Sicily in July 1943 and mainland Italy in September 1943. These campaigns were indeed successful in knocking Italy out of the war, though German forces quickly occupied much of the country, leading to a long and grinding fight up the Italian peninsula and in tying down significant German resources. However, many American strategists viewed this focus on the Mediterranean with suspicion, sometimes seeing it as a diversion from the main effort against Germany and France, and occasionally suspecting Churchill of pursuing specifically British imperial interests in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Another cornerstone of Allied strategy, and one strongly backed by Churchill, was the combined bomber offensive against Germany. This involved the Royal Air Force conducting large-scale night bombing raids on German cities and industrial areas, while the United States Army Air Forces focused on daylight precision bombing of specific military and industrial targets. You see Churchill as a staunch believer in the power of strategic bombing to cripple German war production, disrupt its transportation networks, and break civilian morale. The idea was to bomb Germany back to the Stone Age, or at least back to a point where they couldn't build quite so many tanks and U-boats. It was a grim business, however you sliced it. The policy of area bombing German cities, aimed at dehousing the German workforce and thereby, it was hoped, impacting both morale and industrial output, remains a mainstream historical fact. It was a key part of Allied strategy, supported by Churchill, but it also remains one of the most controversial and morally debated aspects of the entire Allied war effort, particularly in relation to civilian casualties in cities like Dresden. Throughout this period, you also witness Churchill's highly active, some would say intrusive, involvement in the day-to-day conduct of military operations. He had strong opinions on tactics, appointments, and the deployment of forces. His relationships with his top generals, such as Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Montgomery, General Wavell, and General Auchinleck, were often intense and sometimes stormy. Churchill could be fiercely demanding, impatient with perceived inaction, and notoriously quick to sack commanders if he felt they lacked the necessary aggression or fighting spirit. Alan Brooke's invaluable wartime diaries reveal the constant strain of managing Churchill's strategic enthusiasms, his boundless energy, and his sometimes brilliantly insightful, sometimes wildly impractical, military ideas. Brooke often felt his main job was not just to plan the war, but to stop the Prime Minister from having 6 new, contradictory, and potentially disastrous strategic ideas before breakfast each morning. The evolving grand strategy was hammered out in a series of high-stakes inter-allied conferences: Casablanca in January 1943, Quebec in August 1943, and, crucially, Tehran in December 1943, where Churchill and Roosevelt met Stalin for the first time as a trio. You can imagine the atmosphere at these gatherings: immense pressure, clashing personalities, and the fate of millions hanging on their decisions. Those Big Three conferences must have had teams of translators working absolute overtime, not just for converting Russian to English and vice versa, but for translating polite diplomatic suggestion into what I actually mean is you better do this or else. It's a genuine wonder they ever managed to agree on the lunch menu, let alone global military strategy. It was at Tehran that the commitment to Operation Overlord, the code name for the D-Day landings in Normandy, was definitively set for the spring or early summer of 1944. This was a major victory for Stalin and the American viewpoint. Churchill, while still harboring some anxieties, had to accept that the weight of Allied opinion and resources now firmly favored this direct approach. Historians still argue whether Churchill's Mediterranean strategy, with its focus on Italy and the Balkans, was a wise and necessary precursor to Overlord that effectively bled German resources, gained invaluable combat experience for Allied troops, and secured vital logistical routes, or if it was a strategically flawed and costly diversion that ultimately delayed the decisive confrontation in France and was, at least in part, motivated by his underlying desire to protect British imperial interests and influence in Southern Europe and the Middle East. Navigating these strategic minefields, balancing the demands of his powerful allies with his own convictions and Britain's capabilities, required all of Churchill's formidable skill, patience, and, at times, a willingness to make painful compromises, always with the ultimate, overriding goal of total victory in mind. You've witnessed the incredible strategic wrestling matches, the high-stakes debates that characterized the Grand Alliance as Churchill and his Big Three counterparts, Roosevelt and Stalin, navigated the path towards victory. By late 1944 and early 1945, that victory, at least in Europe, was beginning to look not just possible, but inevitable. Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings you anticipated, had succeeded in June 1944. Allied armies were now fighting their way across France, into the Low Countries, and towards Germany's western borders. Simultaneously, the colossal Red Army was pushing relentlessly from the east, driving the shattered remnants of Hitler's Ostheer back through Eastern Europe towards Berlin. But as the prospect of defeating Nazi Germany drew closer, you see Churchill's attention and his anxieties increasingly focusing on the shape of the post-war world. In particular, he was growing deeply alarmed by Joseph Stalin's intentions for the nations of Eastern Europe that Soviet forces were liberating. It became increasingly clear that Stalin's idea of liberation often looked suspiciously like new management under firm Soviet supervision. With little regard for the democratic principles the Western Allies proclaimed, the fate of Poland, for whose freedom Britain had ostensibly gone to war in 1939, became a particular point of concern and contention for Churchill. This pragmatism, or perhaps a grim realism, was starkly evident in October 1944 when Churchill flew to Moscow. There, in a late-night meeting with Stalin, he famously scribbled down what became known as the Percentages Agreement on a half sheet of paper. You can almost picture the scene: the two leaders, wreathed in cigar and cigarette smoke, informally carving up spheres of influence in the Balkans, Romania mostly to Russia, Greece mostly to Great Britain, Yugoslavia and Hungary to be split 50-50, Bulgaria 75-25 to Russia. Churchill pushed the paper across to Stalin, who ticked it with his blue pencil. Churchill later expressed some unease about this rather cynical piece of realpolitik, wondering if it might be seen as callous. It was old-school power politics, for sure. It's like they were attempting to split the bill after a very, very heavy and geopolitically indigestible meal. And some unfortunate countries were essentially being treated as the leftover side dishes. President Roosevelt, notably, was not present at this meeting and was known to be deeply wary of such blatant sphere of influence arrangements, preferring a more idealistic vision of post-war international cooperation. The climax of these high-level, world-shaping discussions came at the Yalta Conference in the Crimean Resort in February 1945. You're there with the Big Three, gathered as victory over Germany seemed just weeks or months away. The atmosphere was a complex mix of Allied solidarity against a common enemy and palpable underlying tension about what would come next. You observe the key players, President Roosevelt, looking frail and visibly ailing, his health clearly declining. Churchill, still pugnacious but representing a Britain economically exhausted by war and with diminishing relative power. And Stalin, confident, implacable, his armies occupying vast swathes of Eastern Europe, giving him immense leverage. Churchill, at this stage, was arguably the weakest of the three in terms of the raw military and economic power he could command. The main issues on the Yalta agenda were monumental. They agreed on the post-war division of Germany into 4 occupation zones, the 4th for France, a point Churchill had pushed for. They finalized plans for the establishment of the United Nations organization, which Roosevelt championed. Stalin, in return for territorial concessions in Asia, including the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin, formally pledged that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 2 to 3 months after Germany's defeat. But the most contentious and emotionally charged issue, particularly for Churchill, was Poland. Agonizing compromises were reached. Poland's eastern border would largely follow the Curzon Line, ceding significant territory to the USSR. In return, Poland was to be compensated with substantial German territory in the west. It was also agreed that the Soviet-backed Lublin government in Poland would be reorganized on a broader democratic basis to include democratic leaders from Poland and from Poles abroad, the London Poles, and that free and unfettered elections would be held as soon as possible. These promises, as you'll see, proved tragically hollow. Churchill fought hard, by his own account, to secure a better deal for Poland and to limit Soviet domination. But he was dealing with the hard reality of Soviet military presence across Eastern Europe. Churchill was like a seasoned world-class poker player, trying to bluff and negotiate with a rapidly diminishing stack of chips against an opponent who not only held most of the high cards, but also seemed to own half the casino. Yalta, almost from the moment it concluded, became one of the most controversial conferences in history. For many, particularly in later years, it was seen as a sellout, a betrayal of Eastern Europe, especially Poland, to Soviet totalitarianism. A mainstream historical fact is that the Yalta Conference agreements, particularly concerning the future of Poland and the vague, ultimately unfulfilled promises of free and unfettered elections in Soviet-liberated Eastern Europe, became a major source of post-war disillusionment and a symbol of perceived Western appeasement of Stalin. Even as the final battles against Germany were being fought, you can sense the Cold War emerging from the ashes of World War II. The fundamentally divergent aims, ideologies, and security concerns of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union papered over by the necessities of wartime alliance, were becoming starkly apparent. Churchill, you see, was growing increasingly disillusioned with Stalin's actions, realizing with a sinking heart that the defeat of one monstrous tyranny was giving way to the rise of another. He began to express his fears more openly, attempting to warn Roosevelt, and later, after Roosevelt's sudden death, President Truman, about an Iron Curtain, though he wouldn't use that exact famous phrase publicly until 1946, descending across the continent of Europe. Negotiating with Stalin, especially as the Red Army controlled so much territory, was probably like wrestling a particularly strong and uncooperative bear. You didn't necessarily do it for fun or expect a fair outcome. You were just relieved if you came out of the encounter with most of your limbs intact, and you certainly didn't expect the bear to suddenly develop a deep appreciation for parliamentary democracy. President Roosevelt's death in April 1945 was a profound shock to Churchill. He had forged a deep, if sometimes challenging, personal and working relationship with FDR. Now, at this critical juncture, he had to build a rapport with a new, largely unknown, and less internationally experienced American president, Harry S. Truman. The final wartime conference of the Big Three, or at least their leaders, took place at Potsdam, outside Berlin, in July-August 1945. By then, Germany had surrendered. The cracks in the alliance were even wider and more ominous. Churchill attended the first part of Potsdam, but in a stunning electoral upset, he was defeated in the British general election of July 1945 and was replaced midway through the conference by the new Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. Historians still argue whether Churchill, at Yalta and in other late war negotiations, did the absolute best he could for Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, given the overwhelming military realities on the ground, Roosevelt's declining health, and his overriding desire to secure Soviet participation in the war against Japan. Or if, with more foresight or a harder line against Stalin, even at the risk of fracturing the wartime alliance, a different, less tragic outcome for millions might have been possible, as the Second World War, the crusade he had so ardently championed, drew to its close. Churchill, the man who had dedicated his life to fighting one form of tyranny, found himself grimly contemplating the ominous rise of another, setting the stage for the next great global confrontation. You recall how, as the Second World War drew to its momentous close, Winston Churchill, the architect of Britain's defiance and a key builder of the victorious Grand Alliance, was already grappling with the ominous shadows of a new kind of global confrontation. His warnings about Stalin's intentions for Eastern Europe, voiced during the Yalta Conference and in private communications, were tinged with a growing sense of foreboding. The defeat of one tyranny, it seemed, was paving the way for the ascendancy of another. Then, in July 1945, just weeks after Germany's surrender, and as he was attending the Potsdam Conference to negotiate the final post-war settlements, came a stunning personal and political blow. The British people, in their first general election in a decade, voted overwhelmingly for a change. Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated in a landslide by the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, his quiet but effective wartime deputy. You see Churchill, the celebrated war hero, the man who had embodied Britain's spirit of resistance, suddenly out of office. It was a shock to him, and to many observers around the world, it was like winning the World Cup, scoring the winning goal in the last minute, and then being told your contract wasn't being renewed because the fans and the club management wanted someone perceived as better at organizing the post-match tea and biscuits and focusing on rebuilding the local community center. The public, weary of war and yearning for social reform and a new beginning, opted for Labour's promise of a welfare state and a different future, though undoubtedly disappointed. Churchill accepted the verdict with dignity, remaining a member of Parliament and now taking on the role of leader of His Majesty's opposition. The post-war landscape that unfolded before him was one of devastation in Europe and rapidly escalating tension between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. Soviet promises made at Yalta regarding free elections and democratic governments in Eastern Europe were systematically broken as communist regimes, backed by the Red Army, were installed in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Churchill's earlier fears were being grimly realized. It was in this context that you find Churchill traveling to the United States in early 1946. He had been invited to deliver a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Crucially, he was accompanied on this trip by U.S. President Harry S. Truman, whose presence lent an unofficial but significant weight to Churchill's words. On March 5, 1946, in that small Missouri town, Churchill delivered a speech that would reverberate around the world and provide the enduring metaphor for the new era of geopolitical division. He declared, in words that have become iconic, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. That phrase, Iron Curtain, was pure Churchill, so vivid, so stark. You could almost hear the rusty clang as it slammed down, cleaving Europe in two. It perfectly encapsulated the reality of Soviet domination in the East and the new, chilling barrier between two ideological worlds. But the Fulton speech, often remembered solely for that single phrase, contained much more. Churchill called for a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and the United States, an alliance of the English-speaking peoples to stand firm against the Soviet threat. He urged strength and resolve, warning against the dangers of repeating the appeasement policies of the 1930s. He spoke of the need for the Western democracies to unite to protect their freedoms and prevent further Soviet expansion. A mainstream historical fact is that Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, is widely regarded as one of the pivotal moments in the public articulation of the Cold War, framing the ideological and geopolitical division of Europe for a generation. The immediate reaction to the speech was decidedly mixed. In the United States and Britain, some hailed his foresight and courage in speaking so bluntly about the Soviet menace. Others, however, particularly on the political left and among those who still hoped for continued peaceful cooperation with their wartime Soviet ally, condemned him as a warmonger, deliberately trying to provoke conflict and poison East-West relations. The speech went down like an absolute lead balloon in Moscow, as you can well imagine. Stalin himself furiously denounced Churchill, comparing him to Hitler and accusing him of trying to instigate a new war. Despite the controversy, or perhaps partly because of it, Churchill continued to speak out forcefully about the Soviet threat throughout his years in opposition. He was a strong supporter of President Truman's policy of containment, including the Truman Doctrine, providing aid to Greece and Turkey to resist communist pressure, and the Marshall Plan, the massive American economic aid program to help rebuild war-torn Europe and counter communist influence. While out of power, he wasn't just twiddling his thumbs or idly painting landscapes. He was actively shaping Western thought on the new global struggle. As leader of the opposition, you see him as a still formidable figure in the House of Commons. He could be a trenchant critic of the Labour government's domestic policies, particularly its program of nationalization and the continuation of wartime austerity. However, on matters of foreign policy, especially concerning the Soviet Union and the need for a strong defense, he often found common ground with Attlee and his foreign secretary, Ernest Bevin, who were themselves taking an increasingly firm line against Soviet expansionism. During these years, he also dedicated himself to another monumental task, writing his multi-volume memoirs of the Second World War. These books, a compelling blend of personal history, grand strategy, and magnificent prose, would profoundly shape public understanding of the conflict for generations to come, and in 1953 would contribute to his being awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. His war memoirs were so detailed, they probably included extensive footnotes on what he had for breakfast on D-Day and the precise blend of his cigars, but they certainly told a uniquely compelling story, especially the bits where he was, rather unsurprisingly to readers of his work, proven to be right about most things. Historians still argue whether Churchill's Fulton speech was a uniquely prescient warning that courageously awakened the West to the true nature and extent of the Soviet threat, thereby helping to galvanize the necessary collective response, or if it was an unnecessarily provocative act that exacerbated East-West tensions, hardened Soviet attitudes, and contributed to the dangerous escalation of the Cold War. What remains undisputed is that, though out of high office, Winston Churchill remained a towering global figure. His Iron Curtain speech provided the defining image and vocabulary for the Cold War, profoundly influencing Western perceptions and policies for decades. He had defined the battle lines of the new, long twilight struggle that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. You'll recall Winston Churchill, out of office after 1945, but still a formidable global voice, delivering that stark Iron Curtain speech which so powerfully defined the emerging Cold War. His warnings about Soviet intentions, his calls for Western unity, and his monumental war memoirs kept him firmly in the public eye, even as he led His Majesty's opposition. But the old lion, as you've seen throughout his long and dramatic life, was never one to remain content on the sidelines if there was a chance to re-enter the arena. And so, in October 1951, after 6 years of Labour government, the electoral tide turned once more. The Conservative Party narrowly won the general election, and you see Winston Churchill, at the advanced age of nearly 77, becoming Prime Minister for the second time, just when many observers thought he was finally settling into his well-earned slippers, his historical writings, and his beloved pastime of painting. The old warrior roared back onto the main stage of British and world politics. Most people his age are diligently perfecting their golf swing or perhaps engaging in spirited debates with the garden squirrels. Churchill, characteristically, decided to take on the rather more demanding task of running a country again, an overachiever to the very end. His second premiership, from 1951 to 1955, was inevitably different in tone and focus from his first crisis-driven wartime leadership. The overriding aim now was not immediate national survival, but rather peacetime reconstruction. The careful management of Britain's declining global power and influence in a world increasingly dominated by the two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, and a constant, deeply felt desire to secure a lasting peace in the shadow of the atomic bomb. His domestic priorities were often summarized by the slogan, "Houses, red meat, and not getting scuppered," a focus on improving living standards and, crucially, avoiding another world war. He sought to ease Cold War tensions, particularly after Stalin's death in 1953, and was a proponent of a summit meeting with the new Soviet leaders, believing that personal diplomacy might yet find a way through the nuclear standoff. On the domestic front, his government largely accepted the foundations of the welfare state that had been established by the preceding Labour administration, though it aimed to reduce state control in some economic sectors and grappled with ongoing post-war economic challenges. Internationally, you see him navigating a complex and often turbulent world colonial crises such as the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and the Malayan emergency demanded attention, as did the simmering dispute over the Suez Canal zone in Egypt. It was also under his second premiership that Britain consolidated its status as a nuclear power. A mainstream historical fact is that Churchill was a strong advocate for Britain developing its own independent nuclear deterrent, a policy that culminated in Britain's first successful atomic bomb test in October 1952. However, the Bulldog spirit, though still present, was contending with the inevitable frailties of age. In June 1953, Churchill suffered a serious stroke, the severity of which was largely and skillfully concealed from the public, Parliament, and even most of his cabinet colleagues for a considerable time. That's a level of keep calm and carry on that probably involved some incredibly inventive excuses for missed meetings and a very loyal inner circle. Though he made a remarkable recovery, his physical powers were visibly waning. The famous energy was diminishing. The formidable parliamentary performances became less frequent, and the steps were a little slower. In April 1955, at the age of 80, Winston Churchill finally retired as Prime Minister, succeeded by his longtime heir apparent, Anthony Eden. He remained a Member of Parliament, becoming Father of the House as its longest-serving member, until he stepped down at the general election of 1964, ending an almost unbroken parliamentary career that had begun in 1900. His later years were spent in cherished retirement, though he was never far from the public gaze. You see him continuing his literary work, completing his ambitious multi-volume A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. He indulged his passion for painting, often at his beloved country home, Chartwell, in Kent, or in sunnier climes like Morocco. Honors continued to be bestowed upon him. Queen Elizabeth II offered him a dukedom, which he declined, though he accepted the honor of being made a Knight of the Garter in 1953, becoming Sir Winston. Later that same year, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, not for any single work, but, as the citation read, for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. Not at all bad for a man who, as you'll recall, famously struggled with Latin and was considered an unpromising student in his early school days. Take that, old Harrow schoolmasters. On January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, Sir Winston Churchill died in London. The nation, and indeed much of the world, mourned. He was accorded a state funeral, an honor rarely given to commoners, and it was an event of unparalleled grandeur and solemnity, attended by representatives from across the globe. You can almost feel the hush that fell over London as his coffin, draped in the Union Jack, was carried through the streets, a final, poignant symbol of an extraordinary era passing into history. His legacy, of course, is immense and multifaceted. For many, he remains, first and foremost, the savior of his country, the defiant voice of 1940, who, through his indomitable will and matchless oratory, inspired a nation to stand alone against tyranny. His speeches are still studied as masterpieces of rhetoric, His historical writings have shaped our understanding of the tumultuous events through which he lived. But he is also a figure of great complexity and, for some, controversy. His staunch imperialism, his views on race, and some of his actions, from Gallipoli and Tony Pandy in his early career to the gold standard decision and the strategy of area bombing in W-Twund, continue to be scrutinized and debated. Historians still argue whether Churchill's second term as Prime Minister was a fitting and dignified coda to a great career, marked by a genuine yearning for peace and the application of elder statesmanship, or if it was a period where his declining health and an understandable attachment to the glories of the past somewhat hampered effective governance in a rapidly changing post-war world. He was, without doubt, a man of colossal talents and equally colossal contradictions, a figure who strode across the stage of the 20th century like few others, leaving an indelible mark that continues to be admired, debated, and reinterpreted to this day. And so, our long journey through the life and times of Winston Churchill, a man who held almost every great office of state, who experienced the depths of political exile and the dizziest heights of power, who wielded both the sword and the pen with extraordinary effect, draws towards its close. From the cavalry charges of his youth to the grave decisions of global war and the anxious dawn of the nuclear age, you have walked with a figure of truly monumental proportions. The echoes of his voice, that distinctive gravelly cadence that rallied a nation and defined an era, still linger in the great halls of Parliament and in the quiet study at Chartwell, where the scent of his cigars might almost seem to hang in the air. The vibrant colors of his paintings, a testament to a spirit that found solace and expression beyond the battlefield of politics, still speak of his multifaceted nature. He was a man woven into the very fabric of a turbulent century, a leader who, for a crucial moment, held the fate of the free world in his hands and did not flinch. As the story fades, and the great weight of those historical events begins to settle, perhaps you can picture him in the gardens he loved, a still figure contemplating the long, dramatic sweep of the years, a life lived at the very epicenter of history's storm. The challenges he faced were immense, the burdens he carried almost unimaginable. Yet through it all, his belief in the resilience of the human spirit and in the destiny of the peoples he served remained a guiding light. May your own path be peaceful as you drift towards sleep, carrying with you the resonance of this remarkable, enduring story.